They say in the kingdom of Oakhaven, power is forged in cold steel and paid for in the blood of the innocent. But the most dangerous weapon in the realm wasn't a sword swung on a battlefield. It was a woman with a memory they tried desperately to erase. If you have ever been told to step aside, to stay quiet, and to know your place, hit that subscribe button and stay with me, because Georgia's story is about to change how you see power forever. Now, let us step into the stifling darkness of a royal carriage, where a kingdom's fate hangs by a single, fraying thread. 143, 144, 145. Georgia Sullivan rigidly counted the rhythmic, bone-jarring jolts of the cobblestones beneath the iron-rimmed wheels of the ducal carriage. It was a desperate, grounding anchor, the only psychological trick keeping her lungs from seizing in panic. The interior of the coach was a claustrophobic, velvet-lined prison. It smelled suffocatingly of rich beeswax, polished saddle leather, and the sharp, metallic tang of the winter night creeping through the window seals. The massive black stallions pulling them moved at an agonizingly slow rhythm, deliberately dragging out her dread as they approached the palace. With every slight sway of the cabin, Georgia's heavy emerald silk gown rustled in the oppressive dark. The sound grated against her nerves, hissing like a serpent's warning she couldn't afford to ignore. Then, the silence shattered. "Do not speak tonight." Duke Jaden Vincent's voice cut through the dark like a freshly honed broadsword, cold, precise, and absolutely lethal. He didn't even turn his head to look at her. His jaw was locked in a tight, unforgiving line, his sharp profile illuminated briefly by the passing flicker of iron street lamps. He sat as rigid as a statue carved from winter ice, the silver embroidery of his military coat gleaming faintly in the shadows. "Do not debate the High Lords," Jaden continued, his tone devoid of any human warmth, delivering a sentence rather than a request. "Do not offer your opinions on the eastern trade routes. Do not, under any circumstances, quote your father's dusty, madman's scrolls. You will wear that green silk. You will stand exactly where I place you. You will look dutiful. And above all, Georgia, do not embarrass me tonight." Georgia swallowed hard, the sudden taste of copper flooding her mouth. She had been biting the inside of her cheek so fiercely it had begun to bleed. She offered no retort, choosing the bitter safety of silent obedience over a futile, fiery argument. Arguing with the Duke of the Western Marches was like arguing with a glacier. It would simply crush you beneath its weight and continue moving forward without a second thought. The tension between them wasn't just an awkward, marital silence. It was a physical wall, thick, suffocating, and pressing painfully against her ribs. She knew exactly why he was like this. All of Oakhaven knew. The kingdom was teetering on a razor's edge, a mere breath away from a devastating, kingdom-ending civil war. Rebellious factions in the east were already arming themselves, and the king's grand summit tonight was the final, desperate attempt to broker a lasting peace. Jaden was the realm's undisputed anchor. He was the only man holding the fractured kingdom together, not with soft diplomacy, but through sheer military intimidation and a cold, calculating logic that left absolutely no room for error. He viewed this royal gala not as a celebration of unity, but as a treacherous battlefield. And on a battlefield, a wild, unpredictable variable was a death sentence. To Jaden, that was exactly what his new bride was, a rustic liability. A wild northern girl forced into his life by royal decree just to secure a volatile border. He saw her only as a political pawn, a ticking time bomb draped in expensive emerald silk. But Georgia was not just a poor, uncultured northerner to be paraded around and ignored. She was the daughter of Elias Sullivan, the realm's greatest historian. Or at least he had been, before the crown ruined him. When the current king demanded her father alter ancient historical texts to legitimize a brutal taxation decree, Elias had staunchly refused. For his unyielding integrity, he was stripped of his ancestral titles, publicly labeled a madman, and banished to the frozen, unforgiving edges of the kingdom. Georgia hadn't been raised in sunlit parlors learning courtly etiquette or how to bat her eyelashes over a painted silk fan. She had been raised in the freezing, drafty stone libraries of the north, her fingers forever stained with ink. Her mind was a magnificent steel trap, armed with the supposedly useless knowledge of ancient linguistics, forgotten dialects, and sovereign laws that had governed the lands centuries before the king's grandfather was even born. She held the true history of the world in her mind, but tonight the truth was forbidden. The carriage rolled to a heavy, final stop, the massive doors of the palace looming outside the window. The grand summit awaited, and the muted Duchess prepared to step into the blinding, treacherous light. The footman pulled the heavy iron handle, and the carriage door swung open, violently shattering the dark. Blinding, golden light poured out from the king's palace, a stark, agonizing contrast to the stifling blackness Georgia had just endured. A cacophony of stringed instruments and raucous laughter spilled down the sweeping marble steps, mixing with the sharp, frigid bite of the winter wind. Jaden stepped out first, offering a gloved hand that was as rigid and unyielding as the rest of his demeanor. Georgia took it, her own ink-calloused fingers trembling slightly, and allowed herself to be pulled from the shadows and into the lion's den. Inside, the sheer opulence was staggering, designed to intimidate and overwhelm. Massive crystal chandeliers dripped from vaulted ceilings painted with scenes of ancient conquests, casting a fractured, brilliant glow over a sea of velvet, silk, and polished armor. Servants wove seamlessly through the throng, bearing silver trays piled high with roasted meats and overflowing goblets of crimson wine. But beneath the glittering veneer of celebration lay a toxic, lethal undercurrent. As Jaden and Georgia moved through the grand entryway, the music seemed to thin, immediately replaced by a rustling, venomous wave of whispers. Faces half hidden behind feathered masks and jeweled goblets turned toward them. Eyes, sharp and assessing as daggers, raked over Georgia's emerald dress, silently cataloguing her every perceived flaw. "The disgraced historian's whelp," a woman hissed behind a painted silk fan, the words carrying perfectly over the lilt of the violins. "A wild northern girl, dragged into the light. Look how stiffly she walks," another muttered, the malice dripping from every aristocratic syllable. They did not see a Duchess of the Western Marches, they saw a stain on their pristine, treacherous court. Jaden's response was immediate, though purely instinctual and utterly devoid of affection. He did not look at her, nor did he offer a whispered word of comfort, but he shifted his broad shoulders, angling his imposing body to physically shield her from the sharpest glares. It was the calculated maneuver of a seasoned general protecting a vulnerable flank. He guided her through the perimeter of the ballroom, his grip on her elbow firm and impersonal, until they reached a recessed alcove draped in heavy, suffocating burgundy shadows. "Remain here," he ordered, his voice barely audible over the swelling music, yet carrying the weight of an iron chain. "Do not wander, do not engage, stay out of sight." With that, he released her arm, turning his back on his bride to wade into the treacherous political battlefield of the dance floor. Georgia sank back against the cold stone wall, a literal piece of background scenery in her own life, watching the man who was legally her husband but functionally a warden. From her gilded cage, Georgia's keen eyes, trained for years to decipher faded rooms and analyze the motives of long-dead kings, easily translated the dangerous language of the living court. She watched Jaden navigate the High Lords, his posture commanding and unyielding. But then, a new figure deliberately intercepted him, Lord Sterling. Even from a distance, Sterling radiated a sickening, unchecked malice. He was a warmonger, a man who openly coveted the vast, resource-rich lands of Jaden's Western Marches and viewed the north as an infestation meant to be eradicated by the sword. Georgia watched as Sterling stepped entirely too close to Jayden, a silver goblet dangling lazily from his thick, ring-adorned fingers. Sterling wasn't adopting the cautious, defensive posture of a man negotiating a fragile peace treaty. His shoulders were entirely relaxed, his smile wide and predatory, his chin tilted in arrogant amusement. Georgia's breath hitched, her fingers tightening in the folds of her dress. She had read enough accounts of ancient wars to know that exact look. It was the smug, relaxed confidence of a commander who had already breached the city gates while the defenders were still arguing over the height of the wall. Sterling wasn't here to negotiate tonight. He was here to conquer. Suddenly, a resonant, deafening crack echoed through the massive hall. The king, seated high upon a gilded dais at the far end of the room, had struck his heavy oak staff against the marble floor. Instantly, the musicians lowered their bows. The laughter died abruptly in the courtiers' throats. The suffocating tension in the room coalesced into a heavy, collective breath. The fate of the Northern Territories, Georgia's home, her people, her legacy, was officially put to the floor. Jayden stepped into the absolute center of the room, standing alone under the unforgiving glare of the chandeliers. His voice rang out, clear, authoritative, and stripped of all emotion. He presented a brilliant, logically flawless diplomatic argument. He cited trade deficits, troop movements, the disastrous yield of the recent harvests, and the economic mutual destruction that a civil war would inevitably bring to the crown. It was a masterpiece of political strategy, a watertight case for peace that left absolutely no room for rational dispute. But as Georgia watched from the shadows, a cold, heavy knot of dread tightened in her stomach. The argument was perfect, yet the courtiers were exchanging sly, knowing glances. Lord Sterling was still smiling, swirling the dark wine in his glass. The air in the ballroom felt too heavy, too still, like the terrifying drop in pressure right before a devastating storm makes landfall. Jayden had brought flawless logic to a diplomatic fight, but Georgia realized with terrifying certainty that Lord Sterling had brought something far deadlier. Jayden's flawless logic hung in the cavernous hall, a fortress of reason that should have ended the threat of war instantly. The numbers were undeniable. The strategic ruin of a northern invasion was a mathematical certainty. Yet, the heavy, ominous silence that followed his speech was not the silence of a convinced court. It was the breathless anticipation of a crowd waiting for the executioner's axe to fall. From the front ranks of the gathered nobility, Lord Sterling stepped forward. He did not look defeated. Instead, he raised his thick hands and began to clap, a slow, mocking rhythm that echoed off the vaulted ceilings like physical blows. "A brilliant summation of copper, grain, and merchant ledgers, Your Grace." Sterling's voice boomed, dripping with aristocratic disdain. He turned his back on Jayden, addressing the king upon the dais. But Oakhaven was not forged by accountants trembling over winter harvests. It was forged by blood, steel, and divine right. And it is by divine right that the North belongs to the crown, to be purged of its wild rebellions once and for all. Sterling snapped his fingers. A trembling servant hurried forward, bearing a heavy, gilded lockbox resting on a velvet cushion. With a theatrical flourish, Sterling undid the iron clasps and drew forth a rolled parchment. It looked ancient, its edges brittle and browned, bound by a massive, cracked seal of dark crimson wax. "I present to the crown," Sterling announced, his voice carrying to the darkest corners of the ballroom, "the lost blood edict of Valerius." A collective, synchronized gasp rippled through the hundreds of courtiers. Even from her shadowed alcove, Georgia felt the blood drain from her face. The blood edict was a myth, a rumored decree from the kingdom's first conqueror that supposedly granted the reigning monarch the absolute divine mandate to eradicate the northern bloodlines and seize their lands. It was a blank check for genocide. "Impossible." Jayden's voice cracked like a whip, his stoic composure finally fracturing. "That document is a ghost story, Sterling, a fabrication to justify a massacre. "Is it?" Sterling sneered, his eyes glittering with malicious triumph. He offered the parchment toward the dais. "Let the king's scholars decide." The king, leaning forward with sudden greedy intensity, gestured with his staff. 3 grand scholars, ancient men draped in heavy, silver-threaded robes, shuffled down from the royal platform. They clustered around the document like crows around a corpse. A servant held a candelabra close as the scholars produced magnifying lenses of polished glass. They traced the heavy runic lettering, examined the grain of the vellum, and held the cracked crimson wax to the light. The ballroom held its collective breath, the only sound the faint, dry scratching of the scholar's fingers against the parchment. Finally, the head scholar turned, bowing deeply to the king. "It is authentic, Your Majesty," the old man declared, his voice trembling but resolute. "The royal seal of Valerius is unbroken. The runes are true. By the ancient laws of the founders, the north is yours to cleanse." In an instant, the Ice Duke melted. Jaden took a half-step back, the movement small but entirely devastating. Georgia watched her husband's broad shoulders drop. His entire diplomatic strategy, built on the unshakable foundations of logic and mutual survival, had just been obliterated by a piece of crumbling sheepskin. Against the sheer weight of divine, ancient law, validated by the crown's own scholars, Jaden was utterly powerless. To argue further was no longer diplomacy, it was heresy and treason. He looked up at the king, seeing the bloodlust ignite in the monarch's eyes, and realized he could not stop the impending slaughter. The war was now legally sanctioned. From her isolated, suffocating corner, Georgia squinted through the dim light. The candelabra held by the servant was casting a bright, flickering glow directly across the surface of the edict. Her mind violently snapped away from the glittering ballroom, plummeting back into the freezing, stone-walled libraries of her youth, where she had sat at her disgraced father's feet for thousands of hours, studying the true artifacts of Oakhaven. She stared at the parchment. She looked at the curvature of the syntax, the way the ancient runes were clustered. "They are too sharp," her mind whispered, a frantic academic reflex kicking in. The spacing is entirely wrong for a Valerian scribe, but it was the ink that made her heart stop. Under the direct yellow flame of the candles, the lettering did not possess the flat, brownish-black fade of ancient carbon soot. Instead, it caught the light with a faint, purplish-black sheen. The realization hit her with the concussive force of a physical blow. Her father had been ruined, labeled a madman, and driven to an early grave for refusing to forge documents exactly like this one. "It is a fake." A deafening roaring filled Georgia's ears, drowning out the murmurs of the warmongering lords. Her chest heaved against the tight constraints of her emerald silk. The terrible weight of the universe suddenly rested entirely on her shoulders. If she remained perfectly still, a dutiful, silent wife hidden in the shadows, Jaden would survive this night politically bruised but physically safe. But thousands of her people, innocent families, children in the northern snows, would be slaughtered under a false banner. But if she spoke, if she took a single step out of this alcove, she would be directly disobeying the terrifying, cold husband who had explicitly ordered her to remain invisible. She would be publicly contradicting the highest scholars of the realm. And when she failed to convince a room full of men who desperately wanted a war, she would face the executioner's block for high treason. The silence of the ballroom pressed in on her, waiting for the North to die. The heavy silence of the ballroom pressed in, suffocating and absolute, waiting only for the king's final word to condemn the North to fire and sword. Then, a single, sharp rustle of emerald silk shattered the quiet. Georgia stepped out of the suffocating burgundy shadows and into the blinding glare of the crystal chandeliers. The rich green of her gown caught the light like a drawn blade, a sudden, jarring splash of color against the sea of muted courtiers. She did not lower her eyes. She did not tremble. "The document is a forgery." Her voice was not a shout, but in the cavernous, dead-silent hall, it rang out with the piercing clarity of a silver bell. The words struck the assembly with the force of a physical blow. For a fraction of a second, absolute shock paralyzed the room. Then, chaos erupted. The king's face flushed a violent, mottled purple. The High Lords shouted in outrage, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of aristocratic fury. "Treason!" someone bellowed. "Silence the northern harlot!" At the edges of the dais, the royal guards moved with lethal synchronization. The metallic shing of steel leaving leather scabbards echoed above the shouting as 4 armored men advanced on Georgia, their swords drawn to silence the insolent girl who dared contradict the crown's scholars. Jaden's blood turned to ice. His worst nightmare was materializing before his eyes. He had ordered her to be invisible, and here she was, commanding the room and committing high treason. The pragmatic military calculus he had relied upon his entire life demanded he step away. Disavow her, claim she was mad, just like her disgraced father, and save his own neck and his political standing. But as the guards closed the distance, Jaden looked at his wife. He expected to see the panicked, trembling girl he had bullied in the carriage. Instead, he saw a queen standing in her own right. Georgia's chin was held high, her posture unbroken, and her eyes held a fearless, blazing conviction that struck Jaden straight through his armored heart. She wasn't acting out of hysteria, she was acting out of absolute certainty. In that split second, Jaden realized that if he let them touch her, he would survive, but he would cease to be a man. The Ice Duke moved. He did not draw a weapon, but he didn't need to. Jaden lunged forward, inserting his massive, imposing frame directly his wife and the advancing royal steel. He didn't flinch as the tip of a guard's blade halted mere inches from his chest. "Sheathe your steel," Jaden roared, his voice carrying the terrifying, undeniable authority of a battlefield commander. He turned his blazing eyes toward the dais, risking his title, his lands, and his life on the intellect of the woman he had called a liability just hours before. "Let my Duchess speak." The king, stunned by the Duke's sudden willingness to commit treason alongside his bride, raised a hand. Hesitantly, the guards lowered their blades. Georgia did not waste the breath Jaden had just bought her. She bypassed her husband, walking directly to the dais where the trembling scholars and a sweating Lord Stirling stood. She did not use weapons. She used the history they had tried to bury. "You claim this is the blood edict, penned by Valerius himself," Georgia said, her voice dripping with lethal academic precision. She pointed a slender, ink-calloused finger at the center of the parchment. "Look at the third stanza. You invoke the crown's right as the absolute sovereign of the northern territories." The head scholar frowned, his silver brows knitting together. "It is the proper term for his absolute rule." "It is an anachronism," Georgia countered flawlessly. The linguistic term sovereign was borrowed from the Eastern empires. It was not introduced into the Oakhaven dialect until the Silk Wars, nearly 3 centuries after Valerius was laid in his crypt. A true document from that era would have used the old tongue term High Overlord. The man who forged this was educated in modern law, not ancient linguistics. A murmur rippled through the courtiers. The head scholar paled, squinting rapidly at the text. Lord Stirling's arrogant smirk faltered, a bead of nervous sweat tracing his jawline. It is a transcribed copy, preserved by later scribes for the royal archives. A mere translation choice by a later monk." "A copy?" Georgia's eyes flashed with predatory triumph. "Then why did you swear before the king that it was sealed by Valerius's own hand? And if it is a preserved relic?" Without waiting for permission, Georgia reached out and plucked a silver goblet of dark wine from the trembling hands of a paralyzed servant. She dipped her index finger into the crimson liquid. "Don't touch it!" Stirling shrieked, lunging forward, but Jaden's heavy hand slammed into Stirling's chest, holding the warmonger back with effortless, terrifying strength. Georgia pressed her wine-soaked finger directly against the edge of a thick, runic letter on the edict and rubbed it firmly. Ancient scribes of the Valerian era used carbon-based soot ink, Georgia explained, her voice echoing clearly as she held the parchment up for the king and the entire court to see. Carbon soot is entirely waterproof. It does not react to the acidic properties of wine. But modern forgers, seeking a darker, richer script, use iron gall. Where Georgia had rubbed the parchment, the supposedly ancient, indestructible rune was dissolving. The ink bled outward, smearing across the brittle vellum in a bright, vivid streak of modern purple. It was undeniable, visual proof. The grand, divine mandate for war was nothing more than a cheap, modern parlor trick. Lord Stirling stood frozen, academically, publicly, and ruthlessly destroyed by the wild northern girl he had sought to eradicate. The vivid purple stain bled across the brittle vellum, a bright, undeniable testament to Lord Stirling's treason. The king's face drained of colour, his regal composure shattering into an expression of absolute horror, followed instantly by blinding rage. He had nearly marched his armies into a catastrophic bloodbath based on a cheap, modern lie. "Seize him!" the monarch commanded, his voice a lethal, vibrating rasp that shook the dais. The royal guards, who just moments before had their blades trained on Georgia, instantly pivoted. They abandoned the Duke and Duchess, lunging across the platform to tackle Lord Stirling to the polished marble floor. The heavy, chaotic clatter of iron armour and the warmonger's desperate, pathetic protests echoed against the vaulted ceiling as he was violently disarmed and dragged away into the shadows. Then came the silence. It was not the oppressive, suffocating quiet of the ducal carriage, nor the tense anticipation of a battlefield. It was a stunned, reverent hush. Hundreds of powerful courtiers, politicians, and generals stared in sheer disbelief at the emerald-clad girl from the north. Suddenly, the head scholar, the very man whose expertise she had just publicly dismantled, lowered his magnifying glass and slowly struck his palms together. A single, sharp clap. Then Lord Peaton joined in from the front row, then another lord. Within seconds, the dam broke. The entire grand ballroom erupted into a deafening, thunderous roar of applause. The high lords and venomous ladies who had whispered cruel insults behind painted silk fans mere minutes ago were now on their feet, cheering wildly for the brave northern girl who had fought a massive war with nothing but words and won. But for Georgia, the roaring crowd quickly faded into a dull, distant hum. The cinematic focus of her world pushed in solely on the man standing beside her. Jaden Vincent, the notoriously pragmatic and ruthlessly cold Duke of the Western Marches, was completely shattered. The rigid, impenetrable military posture he had maintained for a lifetime had entirely evaporated. His broad chest heaved beneath his silver-embroidered coat, and his dark eyes were wide with an emotion Georgia had never seen in him. Absolute awe, deep reverence, and a profound, agonizing regret. He stepped directly into her space, completely ignoring the hundreds of eyes upon them. Slowly, Jaden reached out. The large, calloused hand that had gripped the hilts of broadswords and commanded legions was visibly trembling as his fingertips hovered just an inch from her cheek. Georgia looked up at him, her chest tight, her eyes shining with unshed tears, her chin still held high as she waited for his inevitable reprimand for breaking his rules. "I told you not to embarrass me," Jaden whispered, his voice thick with a raw, broken emotion that barely cut through the ballroom's thunderous applause. He swallowed hard, a single tear catching in his own dark lashes. "I never realized. It was my own ignorance that was the embarrassment." And then, the impossible happened. In front of the king, the high lords, and the entire kingdom, the Ice Duke took a deliberate step back and bowed his head to his brilliant wife. In that single, echoing moment, he surrendered his pride, choosing a true partnership of equals over a kingdom of control. 1 year later, the suffocating darkness of that ducal carriage was a distant, fleeting memory. Warm, golden sunlight streamed through the massive arched windows of a newly constructed wing in the heart of the Western Marches. The air here didn't smell of fear, political venom, or beeswax, but of binding glue, fresh parchment, and blooming mountain heather. A polished wooden sign above the grand entryway read, "The Sullivan Archives." Georgia sat at a massive oak table, carefully translating a fragile manuscript. She hadn't just become a quiet, happy wife, hidden away in a castle. She had fundamentally changed the fabric of her world. She had fully restored her father's disgraced legacy, transforming his madman scrolls into the intellectual and cultural heart of the realm. A shadow fell over the ancient text. Georgia looked up to see Jaden approaching. The imposing, heavy military armor was gone, replaced by a simple, comfortable linen tunic. He pulled up a chair beside her, not as a warden keeping watch, but as a devoted student. He leaned in, his shoulder brushing comfortably against hers, and began reading the restored scroll she was translating. The wild northern girl and the Ice Duke were no longer political pawns. They were the brilliant architects of a new, enlightened era. True power does not lie in silencing those we do not understand, nor does it lie in the edge of a sword. A kingdom built on convenient lies will always shatter under the weight of a single, undeniable truth. And sometimes, the very history we try to bury is the only thing that can save our future. Did Georgia's story inspire you today? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Hit like, share her triumph, and subscribe with the bell on for more epic tales. See you next time.